the idea of Central Asia. We did 10 days of lessons in 2 days, so we need to go fairly slow. So let's first look at your first piece of paper. So you should be turning to your first piece of paper now. And when you're looking at Station 1's page, let's just quickly go through what you should have seen in the video. All right, what you should have seen is that this region of Central Asia has many challenges due to its geography. In particular, it has a rugged landscape. And what we mean by that is that on the fringes of this region, it's surrounded by mountains and deserts. And those deserts and mountains isolate this region from much of the world. The climate is hot, it's dry, with many extremes. We also see that there's a scarcity of water in this region, that though they have many valuable resources, it seems the most valuable is one of the most basic for life. And so we only see fertility in the northern regions of the Fergana Valley, a question that we noticed that some of you had gotten wrong on your assessment, so maybe you want to go back and check your answers for the computer part. The Fergana Valley in the north was a location where farming was able to happen, but today most of the region is still fairly arid. Though the region is rich in these resources that we mentioned earlier, things like gold, things like oil, getting them out is really a challenge because of those mountains and deserts. So the region remains poor today. The Aral Sea. So you should be now turning to your second page there, Station 2. It's a single-sided sheet with questions. So these questions are more open-ended. So I'm just going to talk about what you should have been noticing. Some of you may have questions about your questions, and that's okay to ask. Remember how to ask me, too. Remember that the Aral Sea was truly a lake. It's a landlocked lake. It's called a sea because of its size, its type of habitat for animals, and because of, honestly, tradition. So the Aral Sea was a center for a fishing industry. And the fishing industry that was in the Aral Sea through ancient times up till about the 1950s and 60s was very bustling, very healthy. There were seaside towns, and it was seen for Russians and later Soviets as a vacation location. That sounds great. Vacation location for the wealthy to come out of Russia or out of the cities of Central Asia and go to the Aral Sea for really seaside villas and beach houses. During the Soviet era, though, we have a conversion of the purpose of the Aral Sea. So instead of viewing Central Asia as it is, which is an arid or unfarmable place, the Soviet Union actually invested money in irrigation. They dug ditches and canals which would pull the water away from the rivers of Central Asia to locations that were flat, so that farming could produce better crops of cotton. Because cotton, of course, sold internationally in a modern world, could make a lot of money very quickly for things like shirts. So as they took money and invested it in the region, you would assume that the lives of the people got better. And for some people in very arid and remote places, the life did get better. But for the people of the Aral Sea, it did not. It decreased the water, and by last year, 88% of the Aral Sea had disappeared, not because they were draining the lake. They weren't draining the lake. They were taking its source of water too quickly for it to sustain. So today, many people don't have options. They've moved away. The desert is basically spread towards the Aral Sea. The land was, because of the way the water evaporated, became salty. The salination stuck in the soil, so it actually has killed the small amount of grazing livestock that's in the region. And though there are efforts to reclaim the lake or rebuild the lake by damming up the rivers and slowing the amount of water that could escape, The reality is that it is slow to refill, and it's going to be very, very expensive. The third station is focused on Central Asian history. So just to review some of the important parts, the region was at a crossroads. In particular, it was at the center of the Silk Road, the overland route between Europe and Asia for goods like silk and spices to reach Europe from Asia, or gold to reach Asia from Europe. This area grew in wealth. Central Asian cities grew up around oases and areas along rivers that travelers could restock, replenish, but most importantly could pay taxes. And so as they left with all these goods, they had to pay some of these goods to the people of Central Asia. And so they became very, very wealthy and became a target for invaders. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But the trade will decline heavily around the times of the age of exploration, when Europeans realized that they could sail around Africa and get to Asia and their spices and their later silk. So let's talk about the invaders. There were many invaders of Central Asia. There were the Turks, the Arabs, the Mongols, and then later the Russians. Again, they were attracted by its wealth, and later the Russians were attracted by the potential for land. The invaders to Central Asia brought traditions with them. They brought their language, their religion, they brought their style of dress, and this would be the culture that we see today in Central Asia. The culture today of Central Asia, which we'll talk about in the next slide, is really centered around those invaders. Central Asian history continued. Again, there's a multicultural identity. We see that the traditions, language, and religion are influenced by the groups who moved into the region. For example, Islam was brought by the Arabs. You see yurts being a tradition brought by the Mongols. You see Arabic and Turkish languages being the majority languages of the region because of those histories of invaders. Today, the countries are still recovering. What this means is in Central Asia today, we see that the countries are still recovering from a history of being controlled. The designs of their economies are very much driven by the systems that were put in place by the Soviets or earlier groups. And the beliefs in what government should be are very much influenced by the Soviets and earlier groups. And what we mean by that is most rely on agriculture, even though the land is not very arable. In some of the countries, only 5% of the land is farmable, arable, but farming is their biggest way of making money. So it's important for us to realize that most of this area is poor because of the design of their economy. But they're wealthy countries in that they have lots of resources. They have oil, they have gold. The problem is, like you guys, if you have a stack of gold in your basement, but you can't get it out to sell it, it's just metal in your basement. Wealth comes from being able to sell your resources, not being able to have resources. And so Central Asia's economy relies heavily on these resources, but they can't get them out. And so going forward into the future for Central Asia, there's promise, there's hope. They have resources. They have a modernized country. They have independence and freedom from outside invaders. But it lies in selling their resources, and political instability, the mountains and the deserts make it highly unlikely that it's going to be an easy process for them to gain wealth.